Hello and welcome to another episode of Indie Author Fringe. And right now it is my pleasure to have back for us Mr. Toby Mundy from TMA Associates, the literary agent who represents a number of ALLi professional members in selling their foreign rights, TV rights, film rights, and so on. Hello, Toby.
Hi, Orna, nice to see you.
Always a pleasure. Always great to talk to you. And today we're going to have a little bit of an update because we have been trying this interesting experiment between ALLi and TMA of taking a few of our authors, a select few people, to the rights buyers at the two conferences per year, London Book Fair and Frankfurt, which is fast approaching. So we're going to talk a little bit, get an update from Toby about where we are with all of that and how the experiment is going so far and what we're learning and so on. And then we will deconstruct, essentially, a trade publishing contract and talk about some of the key contract terms and contract clauses that authors need to be looking for. And very often with a publishing contract, it can be what's not there that sets the alarm bells ringing as much as what's actually in the contract. And authors really cannot have enough information about this, even if you have representation and even if you have either a lawyer or an agent. It's really good to have the basic knowledge yourself of what you're dealing with. So Toby is going to take us through a typical publishing contract and talk about some of the key clauses that you need to look out for. But first, tell us a little bit about our rights guide and how it went at London and what's coming up for Frankfurt.
So the first rights guide contained, I think, 12 authors who had between them sold very significant numbers of books, remarkable numbers. And I think it's fair to say that the interest in the book in the guide was really very significant. I mean, we sent it out very widely and we sent it to some of the big publishing bosses who came back and said, this is great. And we've sent it around our departments and other places. And everyone, I think, feels they need to keep a watching brief on what's going on in the independent author space as the giant conglomerates become more and more like brand management systems. They're very happy taking Zoella off YouTube and publishing a book by her, or taking someone who's famous and making famous for one thing and making them successful in the book publishing space. They are becoming more and more accustomed. They're more and more uncomfortable trying to make audiences for books. So what they like about indie authors is that they often bring an audience with them, and there's a story to tell about them. And a good self-publishing story is still a good underdog story. So lots and lots of interest. Sales are harder to come by, but we think the first one did its job, and we're quite well placed to begin to build now. So we've had a couple of smallish translation deals. We've got other interest. We had quite a lot of interest and quite a lot of stuff was called in. The fact that since the London Book Fair in April, things haven't come in thick and fast is not that surprising. It can sometimes take quite a while to do deals, particularly in genre fiction where the commissioning editors have lots to read in their own language and they're often then having to read things in English. But it's encouraging. I mean, even now, while we're having this conversation, one of the other people in the guide is having a conversation with some film people in LA, which I think is nice. But so we're talking and they're talking, and we could maybe all speak together at some point. So it's all kind of, I feel encouraged, and I think this thing will grow. We've planted this seed now. So, more news as it happens, I think.
Yeah, and I mean, we always said that it was going to be slow. I worked very briefly as a literary agent in the past, and I know that rights in particular take ages, and it was never going to be an overnight thing. And the thing is to sort of really embed it and root it rather than to be aiming for kind of quick anything. And publishing never does quick, and trade publishing definitely never does quick.
And to learn from each iteration what to do, I think, and how we can do it a little better. So this time we want to be focused. One of the great strengths of indie author publishing is its genre busting ambition, but sometimes that's just a bit our friends and colleagues in the trade houses worry with those sorts of things about where to put those kinds of books in the bookstore and all that other kind of stuff that writers hear over and over again. So, there's only so much innovation they can cope with, I think, these people. It's also true, though it's much less true than it was, but it's still a factor that foreign companies are uneasy making contracts and doing deals with individuals in foreign countries. They don't mind they're more comfortable, they're more accustomed, they're just more used to doing deals with companies in other countries. So there is a small psychological component to that. I don't think it's huge, but it's not nothing either. So all of these things are going to come out in the wash. Everybody knows that this is the space where talent is emerging from, where interesting and exciting things are happening, where innovation is happening, where new stories are being pioneered. And I've thought all along, and continue to think, that it will only take a couple of quite modest successes to come out of this guide, and suddenly everything will happen. So, it takes a long time to build a brand and to build a product, and this rights guide is a product, and it's a showcase for other people's work. In my other life, I'm the chairman of a book festival. It's taken 10 years for that book festival to develop profile. I'm connected to a book prize. It's taken 18 years for that book prize to develop, really, So these things take a while to build brands, and because of digital technology, we think things can happen overnight. But I don't think it's going to take 10 or 18 years, but it might take, a couple of years of plugging away before we start to get to the next level. But success begets success. So once we get some smaller successes, I'm fairly sure that other stuff will follow. It's funny how it's still a very herd-like business, I'm afraid.
Yes, it certainly is. And I think indies can find that frustrating, and certainly don't say anything like 18 years, 18 months to an independent author sounds like forever, So, and I think, however, that if we want to sell rights, we have to, the other thing about authors is book writers and publishers are very patient people. I mean, patience just by the drill of writing a book. Anything over 55,000 words is a long-term endeavor, especially the first time you do it, and then you've got to learn how to publish it. And then selling rights is another whole thing again, with a whole different kinds of sets of skills and knowledge and communities and people to get to know and so on. So none of this is easy, but it's all very interesting. Can we just talk very briefly about the rights space itself? Are you seeing any changes there? I mean, let's talk about translation first. How's it looking at the moment?
I think it's very hard to generalize, actually. I don't think the underlying, from my conversations and from our other activities, I don't think there's any evidence there's anything particularly big that's changed. I think the underlying principles remain the same. Everybody wants that which is original and that which is proven. There was always an old rule of thumb, which is that if the work hasn't been quite dramatically successful in its native language, it's very hard to make it successful in a secondary language. And I think people are sticking to that rule more than ever. Everyone wants proof of concept. And there remains this big difference between being a market maker and a market taker. So if one publishes a book by an author who hasn't been published anywhere else, then you're the market maker. But if you can then publish that book in translation or publish that book overseas, and you've already got a track record, a story to tell, big success, you're a market taker. You can go out into your media and your booksellers and say, well, look, this author has sold 100,000 ebooks in their own language. We are confident that we can do something dramatic here too. So, I don't think any of those rules have changed. Everyone's looking for good work all the time.
Sure, and that's the sort of basic unifier. But what I find interesting when working with you on this guide is the different perspectives that you approach an author with. In terms of just what will work. You talk constantly about the story you need to be able to tell about a writer. And, often you and I have this experience where I think, oh, here's a great writer. They've sold loads of, Toby's going to love this one. And then when we chat about it, actually the story even though it's superbly impressive and, you know, unbelievably so in some cases, it doesn't fit what rights buyers are looking for. Can you just talk to us a little bit about that? Because I think Indies will find it very interesting. For example, having lots of series or having, you know, lots and lots of books, which we all admire hugely, those productive authors who manage to get a lot of books out. It's not necessarily an advantage when it comes to selling the rights. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Of course. So I think the two poles around which the entire publishing industry, whether it's independent publishing, independent authorship, conglomerates or whatever, the two poles around which everything orbits are the original and the proven. That which is original and that which is proven. And you could argue sort of philosophically what those words mean, but we know what they mean in kind of everyday language. And unless the publisher, the traditional publisher, but also the author, can tell a story about themselves or their work, or both of those things, that involve one of those two concepts, the original and the proven, it's very hard to get noticed. So an author could be proven, and the obvious way in which they could be proven is because a lot of people have bought their books, or because we were talking recently, you know, and there's one of the ALLi members has got over 100 5-star reviews on Amazon. Well, that's a level of proof. I can say the book is great, but if 100 other people or more have said it's really great, who we've never met before, that's better. So the proof can come in lots of ways, but generally it's going to involve sales, and to a lesser but not a significant extent, genre or category. So there are certain kinds of genre, girl on a train type, girl books, if you like. So that's a proven genre at the moment, although those fashions pass quickly. And then there's the original. So there are these stories that are very hooky, that no one's ever told before, that are very original. Now every author thinks they're telling original stories, but those original stories, we have to be able to tell a story about the work. So when you're pitching, you're telling a story about the book itself, not the story of the book. You're not saying, and then she went and got married, and then he ran off with the next door neighbor. You're not saying that. You're telling a story about the work, which says the book was published in October 2015. It started slowly, but very quickly, word of mouth took hold, and now it's sold 100,000 digital downloads. It's sold some a number off their own website and CreateSpace and KU and other things. It's got 150 5-star reviews on Amazon. You're telling a story about the life of the book, if you like. You're telling the biography of it. And equally, you're telling stories, if you can, it's not critical, but if you can, about the author. Well, the author used to be a forensic scientist, and now they're a marine biologist, and before that she was an astronaut, and all that stuff. And by the time you've finished, you've told a story about that work. What you're not doing is telling the story of the work. But you're having a pitch, but that's a 30-second thing. And you're not saying the book is brilliantly written, and this distresses authors when they hear this. But frankly, you wouldn't be pitching it at all if it wasn't very well written. So it's not a sales point. You can't say it was really well written, because the people you're talking to expect that.
Yeah.
And if you said it's really well written, I've had it many times when I first started out, where people are saying, well, why are you telling me that? Because if am I to assume that the ones you don't say that for aren't well written? And you go, no, they're all well written. To which they say, well, don't bother to say it then. So the fact that the writing is really jolly good is the least of it.
It's a basic.
And then you're looking. Then you're always looking. I can say something's great, but you're always looking for external validation, because I have a vested interest in saying it's great, because I want them to buy it from us on behalf of our clients. So I'm always looking for ways of other people saying it's great, or other people, or demonstrating it's great through empirical means, like sales, like Amazon reviews, like other stuff. On the matter of series, very quickly, the bottom line is that if you're a German publisher and you can just about see over the top of your desk because of this pile of submissions and paper in front of you, we've got to be able to direct them with a clear message as, here's where you start and here's why you start here. And that's it. And if the book has been circulating in English for 5 or 6 or 7 years, or even 4 years, it's very hard to persuade them to start there, because they think, well, it's old news, or why hasn't anyone else picked it up by now if it's so good? Or some other story. So I know it drives indie authors nuts, and it's understandable that backlist is so hard, but publishers who are considering the work have to start somewhere. You have to say, this is the first thing you should read, and that almost always will be the most recent thing. And if we think about it, I mean, box sets or something, maybe people do start at the beginning of them, but in the end, you've got to jump into a big series somewhere. And what publishers want to start with is the most recent one that is also successful, and that's just at the moment how it is.
Yeah, that's very interesting to me. When we started working together, you know, very often our conversation will come down to you say, yeah, but which book are we going to go? You know, not even which series, but it has to come down to starting with one particular title.
Yeah, and then if it is a series book, it's very hard to direct someone to the 5th book in the series. So you have to direct them to the first book in the series. And if that first book was published, for example, in 2011, well, that's a fair old time ago, you know, and so it makes the story you're telling about the book more complicated. It makes it harder. It makes the book seem like old news. You know, people want the new thing. They want the new exciting thing. They want the thing that there's a buzz around. You know,
it's so interesting because one of the things I think that self-publishers love about being indie is that, in a way, you're like Bob Dylan. You know, you're on the never-ending tour, and you can decide, oh, I'm going to give this book some airtime now, and it could be something you wrote 10 years ago. It doesn't matter. You decide to go out promoting, marketing, doing something new with it. And it's the kind of thing that a trade publisher will never do. They don't really go back to backlist at all. And
if you're sorry to interrupt you, they will if the author has become a brand, they'll go back and hoover up everything.
Yeah.
But I think the key thing here is one of corporate publishing's dirty secrets, which lots of indie authors know all too well, painfully from experience, which is that the big conglomerates have many strengths. They really do. They're full of clever, hardworking, nice people who are quite committed and really want the best for those books. But they sit on a conveyor belt, and that conveyor belt, the authors can feel themselves sitting on the conveyor belt. It drives them crazy sometimes. But also that the big conglomerates, don't tell anyone, are not very good at making markets. They're not very good at building audience. And they need buzz. They're very susceptible to buzz, and that for an indie author to cross over into a traditional publishing space, whether it's in their own language or in a second language, you still need buzz, because the commissioning editor needs to take that magic golden that thing, buzz, and take it into their publishing company and give it to other people to energize them. And buzz is that sort of intangible thing that is a key part of the publishing business. It's not the same as hype, you know, and it's part of the process. And that's why a book from 2011 that doesn't have buzz around it, they just can't really understand what to do with it.
Fascinating.
It's weird but true.
Yes, it's very, very interesting. Okay, so we're off to Frankfurt. As you said, we have had some small successes for some of our authors, and they're very happy with that. And we will continue, and we'll come back with more news after Frankfurt when we know what's going to happen then at that point. Sorry, yeah?
Watch this space, yeah.
Watch this space, absolutely. And this particular story will run for quite a while yet. But let's just turn to sort of a completely different topic. We'd like to help authors to understand contracts a little bit better than they do. And I thought it would be really useful if you could sort of bring us through the anatomy of a contract and the key. We can't possibly cover all the clauses, we'll be here all evening, but the key clauses that an author needs to look out for if they are presented with a trade publishing contract. And we'll start with, you know, the contract as the home purchase, if you like. I'm not quite sure what the term is there, but I'm not talking about, in other words, a contract for a rights deal,
yes.
a sub rights deal. We're talking about a base contract. So you've decided as an indie that you are going to sell maybe the print rights to a trade publisher, or maybe you're going the whole hog and you're going to, you know, give your book to a trade publisher and see how they get on with selling it and so on. how do we make sure that the contracts that protect, or sorry, the clauses that protect us are in there, and that if things don't go well, we can get our rights back and so on. So over to you.
Right. So a publishing agreement determines. So contracts are about what is possible, not what is probable. So they contain a multitude of clauses to try and cover off possibilities, because the law in general and contracts in particular are trying to reduce uncertainty, because in the event that there is a dispute between two parties, you expect the contract to have something to say about the point of disagreement between the two of them. So it's in both sides' interest for the contract to be clear and to be comprehensible. In general, and it pains me to say this, the big corporations tend to have slightly fairer contracts than the small independent publishers. Now, it pains me to say that because I was an independent publisher for a long time. But in general, let us say for the sake of argument, Penguin Random House has a pretty fair contract. They have a large contracts department, and they're not in the business of tweaking the contract particularly because the author is unagented or whatever. It's a standard agreement. Now, that's not to say that a good agent won't improve key clauses of that agreement, because they certainly will. But what I could say with relative confidence is that a contract, as it were, from Hachette or Penguin Random House is not going to contain rip-off clauses. It's not also to say that the commercials couldn't be better. It's hard to look you in the eye and say a person without an agent who has a publishing contract shouldn't take advice, because they really should. It doesn't matter if it's, I mean, it could be from an agent, it could be from the Society of Authors, it could be from somebody, but they haven't gone into this process because they are really good at publishing agreements. They've gone into this process because they're really good at telling stories. And, you know, so they probably, a good advice will pay for itself usually in one form or another, particularly on the commercial side. So with all of those caveats, let's think about this. Well, the first thing is that, are you being paid an advance or a fee? It's quite a big difference. An advance is a shorthand term for an advance against future royalty earnings, and operates in a specific way. A fee, put simply, is all the money you're going to get. That's it. It doesn't matter if the book sells 5 copies or 5 million copies. That sum of money, that fee of, for the sake of argument, £1,000, is all the money you're ever going to see from the deal. So fees tend to be not as good as advances against royalties, and they operate quite differently. An advance against royalty is very simple. If you receive an advance against royalty, which for the sake of argument is £1,000, and you accept that advance against royalties, that means the publisher opens up a royalty account for you, and the opening balance of that royalty account is minus £1,000. That's the sum of money you've received. And as when the book is published and starts to sell, so let's say it's a £10 book with a 10% royalty, that's £1 per copy, goes into the royalty account like water, like liquid going into a bucket. And eventually the level goes from minus 10,000, minus 1,000, minus 999, 998, blah, 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 up it goes, glug, 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 up, 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 up. And eventually it starts to come out the top, and that's when the advance has earned out. So that's what your advance means. It's an advance against future royalty earnings. And as those future royalty earnings come in, the negative level of the advance goes out, and eventually we hope becomes positive. And there are ways that can be accelerated through the publisher exploiting subsidiary rights and other things, which can put quite large lumps of money into the royalty account and help it earn out more quickly. So fees, not so good. Advances, better.
And just talk on that, particularly around that, on escalators as well, how they can make a difference for that.
Well, advances are separate from royalties, and royalties should contain escalators. But the very first distinction is between advances and fees. And if you can avoid taking a fee, one should avoid taking a fee.
Sure. So I meant just in relation to the earning out, you know.
Yeah, well, if we can. So the next thing is about. I mean, there are other things connected to that, but yes. So royalty rates are fairly standard in the industry. They vary massively between territory, between languages. So, for example, some countries, let's say Italy, tend to have royalty rates that are pretty low. Other countries, the Anglophone world, Britain, America, to some extent Australia and Canada, have pretty standard royalty rates these days. Whatever those rates are, if the book sells a lot of copies, there should be some upward escalation, by which I mean the royalty should get better. So when a book doesn't succeed, or when a book succeeds modestly, as a general rule of thumb, the publisher makes about the same profit as the author does. When a book starts to really, really take off and work very, very well, unless the author's royalty improves, the publisher tends to earn a disproportionate amount of the profit. So that escalator, conventionally on paperbacks, for example, is at 20 or 25,000 copies. Now, if you're a very, very famous author, you might get a faster escalator. And if you're a less famous author, you might have to settle for a lower escalator, say 30,000 copies. But generally, in the 20 to 30,000 paperback level, you'd expect the royalty rate to go from 7.5% to say 10% in paperback. In America, that escalator rate is much harder to get. A lot of American houses like offering flat rate royalties on paperbacks. But if you can get it, it might come at, say, 100,000 or 150,000 copies. But there is no doubt that in my mind, there is a moral and commercial case for arguing that if the book really, really starts to work, the royalty rate should get better. Now, there is a whole conversation, and you and I might be sitting here till sunrise if we get into it, about high discounts, which is where the royalty rates get adjusted because of the terms of trade on the, because of the publisher, because of the terms of trade the publisher has with the bookseller. Basically, if the publisher is selling books to the bookseller at enhanced terms of trade, it will mean that the author suffers in their royalty rate. Now, this has turned into a rather malevolent scam in which the authors suffer, because what it used to be that if the publisher was having to give exceptionally high terms of trade to the retailer to get the retailer to stock the book in quantity, then the author would have to share some of the publisher's pain. Now those terms of trade, thanks to a number of retailers, but well, a number of retailers actually, I couldn't lay it all on Amazon's door, but those terms of trade now have become standard. So what used to be exceptionally high terms of discounts for terms of trade have become standard terms of trade. So much more of the author's royalty rates are depressed and suppressed in the day-to-day run of business. It's a very nefarious setup.
It certainly is. We've seen lots of it. Would you talk here about the importance of the percentage based on received or price?
I can't certainly, I wouldn't, in all of this, I'm not speaking for the agenting community. I've had a number of roles in this industry and I do know my way around book contracts. But these are very much my views. The standard rate for ebooks is 25% of receipts, as everyone in the self-publishing space knows. Rates for printed books continue to be calculated on the basis of published price. So to make a simple example, on a hardback book with a $20 published price, the standard royalty rate will be 10%, $2 a book. Now that could then be subject to adjustment because of those high discount things I was talking about earlier. But that's a reasonable rule of thumb. It is still, I believe, just about in the author's interests for them to have royalties on their P-books based upon the published price. Now, there are some caveats around that, and if we have this conversation in a year's time, I may change my mind. But if a publisher offers an author a royalty rate on their printed books that is based upon a price received, and if that price received is not at least 15%, then there is a measurable chance they're being taken to the cleaners. Or, to be fair to the publisher, that the publisher is capable of giving them a bit better. Actually, I'll take that back about taking to the cleaners. We should have a little side conversation about that. You can't really moralize about book contracts. You would expect, if you're in business with a publisher who has published books that are pretty good and has an okay reputation, they're not crooks. People put into publishing agreements what they can get away with. The big conglomerates don't bother to do that because it takes too much time to twiddle with contracts. But smaller houses can put things in there. Their standard contract contains a few things they hope they can get away with. It's really up to the author to look out for themselves and to make sure that they're not caught out. But there are cowboys and distributors around, but for the most part, no one's trying to rip off anybody else. However, if you see P-book royalty rates in your contract that are based on receipts and are 10% of receipts, 7.5% of receipts, 5-6% of receipts, it's possible that the publisher has more that they can offer, and they should be offering more.
Yeah, and we're certainly seeing that.
Yeah. Now, the reason I said I might change my mind in a year's time is that I think this question is becoming so complicated because of the adjustments that publishers are able to make to royalty rates, that there may well be a time that it would be in the author's interests to receive a flat 25% of all income that comes in. So you receive maybe 20% of all income that comes in on the first $50,000, $100,000, rises to 25, rises to 30, rises to 40. Now, I've said this to other agents and they start shouting at me and prodding me in the chest. But this is something like this would be, and the reason they do that, I think, is because some of it reduces some of the agent mystique a bit. But actually, as a piece of deal making to help the client, it might be a more transparent world. We'll see. We'll see.
Interesting.
Other things. It is fairly standard for authors to have to clear permission to quote from other people's works. That always is the author's job. It's perfectly reasonable for the publisher to argue that that is part of the work and therefore should be the author's responsibility. Where indexes are concerned, it's perfectly standard for the author to pay all of the index, although many publishers will agree to pay half the costs of indexes. And all publishers are capable of commissioning indexes on author's behalf. More materially, copyright should always be retained by the author. You should never assign your copyright to the publisher. I've seen publishers who are experimenting as content houses, particularly in America, where they're sort of hoarding content, which they want to repurpose any which way they want. And that involves the author assigning the copyright to their work to the publisher. That should not happen. Moral copyright and copyright should remain with the author, and the publisher is given a grant of rights in the agreement, which gives them the freedom to produce printed, ebook, whatever it is. It should define the kinds of work and the kinds of products they're allowed to create and the places in which they're allowed to sell those products. But it's a grant of rights by the author to the publisher. Should not be an assignment of all copyright.
Should we talk here about the divide in the I think it's funny to have the sound there. Are you hearing me twice?
No, I'm hearing you once.
Okay, fine. I'm hearing myself back. No worries. Should we talk here about the anatomy of the contract around assigning rights, and the difference between, not assigning rights, licensing rights, and the difference between sort of the base rights, if you like, and the subsidiary rights?
Yes. So a contract is a grant of rights between an author and a publisher. And that grant of rights in its most basic form is the right to produce a printed book. Probably most publishers in the trade space will insist upon an ebook, although I know your members are getting better and better at negotiating deals around that. But almost certainly, definitely a print book, probably a request for the ebook. Then other rights that the publishers are better placed to exploit often than some authors. Serialization rights. What else? Audiobook rights often. A publisher may often argue that they are that any market that exists for the audio rights will be because of the efforts that they've made on the print rights, and therefore they should be cut into that. Now, it's a reasonable argument. It's not an irrational argument. And lots of agents and lots of authors are not very good at exploiting audio rights.
No, but the difference with self-publishers is that often they like to make their own audiobook. Or
Understood.
Yeah.
No, absolutely.
Which is slightly different again. Yeah.
Yeah.
So in that case, you wouldn't part with them, and that's what would happen. It would be a conversation.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, yes, it would be a conversation, but it is relatively standard for a trade house to make a bid for, or a pitch for, volume rights, printed books, ebook rights, serialization rights, book club rights, and audio rights. And their argument would very often be either that we've made the market for the print book and therefore we should have some of the benefit from the audio book, which is a sort of derivative product, and that we have relationships with book clubs. Now, in the old days, book clubs were a big piece of the business. These days, they're struggling a bit, but it's still a piece of business, particularly in America. The book clubs can still be very big. So that's the standard bill of fare about the grant of rights, and then attached to that is a grant of territorial rights. And those territorial rights describe the places where the publisher has the exclusive right to produce their edition and their edition alone. So for the sake of argument, let's say it's Penguin, and Penguin have bought UK and Commonwealth rights in a novel. That means they have the exclusive right to produce a printed edition of that book in the UK and Commonwealth, probably including Canada as well. And then on the end of the contract, called a schedule of exclusive territories, will be a definition of all the places where that exclusivity obtains. So it will begin with the UK, with Ireland, and then Australia, New Zealand, Canada, and so on. What that means for the author is that if they are a self-published author, they have to withdraw the book from those territories, because they've assigned the right, the exclusive right to sell that book in those territories to their publisher. So they can't produce a competing edition in those territories. They may be able to do that, continue to do that in a territory where they haven't assigned the right. So for example, an ALLi member, Sasha O'Hara, who's done some rather funny colouring books, she publishes herself in the United States and in North America, but in the UK she's published by Hachette, which is a large trade house. And the contract specifies that Hachette has the exclusive right to produce the work in the UK and Commonwealth, excluding Canada, and that she can continue to work in North America on her own. But so her obligation to Hachette was in return for the advance against royalties, she had to withdraw the book from the UK and Commonwealth markets via Amazon and other self-publishing platforms, which she was quite happy to do because she was content with the deal that they were offering her. So yeah, that's more or less how it works. And generally speaking, and particularly with unagented authors, the publishers will always look for as many rights and as much territory as possible. And they won't do that because they're evil. They'll just do that because they're entitled to ask. And the author may not be, unless the author has an agent, it's going to be very, very, very hard for them to sell Italian, Dutch, French, Taiwanese, Korean, Portuguese language rights. I mean, it's very hard for self-published authors to do that, or for any author without an agent to do that.
It does happen, though. We do have some members who have. We've one particular member who sold rights in 24 countries himself without an agent. So
absolutely. It can be done.
It's loads of work. It's
a massive amount of work, and for lots of authors, that's not why they went into writing their own books. But of course, I'm not making a moral point, and it can be done, but it's hard.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, other key clauses we should be looking out for?
Any advance that an author receives is always divided into installments. There should always be a payment on signature of the agreement, or usually always. There's often a payment on delivery and acceptance of the manuscript, and there's usually often a payment on first publication in the territory. So don't be surprised if the contract contains payments in installments. The accounting, so we've talked about royalties, we've talked about advances. The accounting for the author is entitled to receive a royalty statement from the publisher, ideally if it's a big house twice a year, some of the smaller houses pay only once a year, but there will be a period where they have to account for the sales of the book. And that should result in a piece of paper being emailed or sent through the post to the author, which transparently and in language that anyone can understand describes how many copies have been sold, on what terms of trade, what the royalty rate was, and what they've received. Some of these documents are woefully inadequate in terms of transparency, but publishers are getting a little better at it. The accounting periods are usually, but not always, January to June and then July to December. The publishers then have a further 3 or 4 months to make up the contract. So by the time the statement comes through, it's often describing ancient history, sales that took place sometimes 9 months ago. It's not satisfactory, and Amazon have thrown down a challenge by starting to remunerate and report monthly that the trade publishing industry, in the Anglophone world at least, is finally trying to pick up. They've got to report more and better and more often, and I believe it will happen. And I believe it will be in the publisher's interest for it to happen, because it means that when authors promote their work, they'll be able to see more directly a relationship between the promotional activities they undertake and the sales of the book. They'll know that if they schlep off to this writers' festival next month, they may see in the following month's payment the benefit of that, because they might sell 200 or 300 books, whatever. So there is usually a thing about accounting dates in those agreements, and ideally it should be more than once a year. There is also about reserves against returns, which is the publisher's right to hold back royalty earnings because of future trade sales. Now, it is reasonable for a publisher to insist that the author only be paid royalties on books that have actually been sold to the book rather than lent to bookshops. So book publishing remains a sale or return business. If the retailer can't sell the book, they can send it back. The great American publisher Alfred Knopf once characterized this as gone today, here tomorrow. And so if you're lending copies of the book to the bookshop on a sale or return basis, then the publisher is entitled to hold back as a reserve against future returns from the bookshop some percentage of royalty earnings. There are 2 things to bear in mind. The first of it is that returns, that is to say, unsold copies of the book from booksellers to publishers, as an overall fact of life in the publishing industry, are falling. They're falling because Amazon so they're falling because of Amazon's technology, because of technology in general, because retailers don't need to build up lots of stock. They can reorder much more quickly and have stock more quickly. So the percentage of the amount of copies that get sent back from retailers is lower than it used to be. The other thing is that the publishers should only be able to levy this reserve against returns, this deduction on royalty earnings, on copies of the books that have been sold through the book trade. I've seen catch-all clauses that seem to include ebooks and book club sales, even though neither of those editions ever get sent back. So they can be sneaky around that. And what it allows them to do is just hold money back. So any reserves against future returns can only be against book trade sales, and the language should never be able to include ebook editions or copies of editions sold to book clubs, because those are always firm sale, non-returnable sales. So that's interesting. There is also the matter of credits. You should always be credited as the author on the cover of the book. You are usually entitled to be consulted about the cover of the book and the look and feel of the book, but I'm afraid very, very, very few extremely unfamous authors have control over the cover of their book. It's one of those things. It should be different, but we have to trust publishers at some extent that they can do these kinds of things. Then the last really big piece of all of this, I think, is to do with reversion and termination. So I've been at publishers' conferences when I was a publisher in which people have stood up who should remain nameless, but from academic publishing, and argue that termination and revision clauses should be taken out altogether, e.g. that it should be impossible for authors to get their work back. That is immoral. And there is no amount of money that a publisher can pay, really, that would justify that. So there has to be some provision for termination of the contract and for reversion of the rights back to the author who was, in the initial at the beginning of the contract, given a grant of those rights. Usually the trigger is thing going out of print. Now, authors confuse out of stock and out of print. Out of print doesn't have a particularly clear-cut definition, but out of stock does. It's out of stock. It's not in print. It's not available through the book trade. And there should be some reasonable provision that if the book is not available in its print edition through established retail outlets, that the author has the opportunity to request that the book be put into print. And if the book is not put into print within 6 months of that request, then the author is entitled to automatically have those rights back. And that would mean the complete termination of the contract, not the partial termination of it, but the complete termination of that contract. Now, there are lots of funny language around these things. So I've seen clauses where if the book is available, it's deemed to be in print. Well, ebooks are always available. So you can't really accept that. What one really wants is a print book definition. I've seen definitions which include the amount of stock in the warehouse, but frankly, authors have no control over the amount of stock in the warehouse and only feel depressed if there's a lot of copies in the warehouse. It's not that important. What's important is the number of copies being sold. And if some commissioning editor or somebody's made a mistake and printed too many books, that doesn't mean the book is selling. So that should be a function of sales and not stock. So, if what we think is fair is something along the lines of, if the book has sold less than 100 or 150 print edition copies in the previous 2 accounting periods, e.g. 200 copies in the previous year of the print edition, then the author has the right to ask for that back. Now, that could even be a lower number. You could accept 100 copies, but you need something along those lines, I think.
It's at that point, the contract very low, isn't it? I mean, so you have to, you might find as an author that you're unhappy with the number of books that's being sold when it's higher than that. I mean, that seems to me to be very low. Yeah,
I mean, if you take, let's think about this for a second. If you take 100 copies over 6 months, that's only about 15 copies a month, isn't it? About 18 copies a month. So that isn't very many. It's about 4 copies a week. Yeah, that's not very high. I agree, but many publishers would argue that's commercial activity. Now that they are able to do very low-run digital reprints, 50 or 100, 150, 200 copies at a time, they can continue to make a margin from that. It's a toss-up. It's not a clear-cut case.
Sure.
And it's good moral. There is a moral dimension to it, but they've invested in the work. They've invested in printing the work. It's borderline. I think ideally 40 or 50 copies a month represents a reasonable sale. 10 copies a week. It still doesn't sound like much from a self-published author's point of view. But I've looked at lots of print over the years as a publisher. I looked at lots of stock sales, and that's what publishers' backlists are made up of. That the backlist is a very valuable part of the publisher's business, and they're keen to defend it. And their backlists are full of books that sell 50 copies a month.
Sure. I think the important thing you're saying is, make sure there's a reversion clause in there.
Make sure there's a reversion clause. I've seen very respectable publishers accidentally, deliberately forget to put one in. So that's the first thing. And then make sure that there are terms for reversion that are based upon sales and not stock, and that the sales quantities are specified and they are reasonable. You'll end up arguing about what's reasonable, but they should be something. And as I say, publishers are entitled to build up their back catalogues. They're entitled to be profitable and make money. And even if you as an author are not happy with the absolute number, it may mean that you have to wait a little bit longer to get your rights back, but at least there's a mechanism to get them back.
Yeah, which is really key. I think it's become so much more important now that we have self-publishing as an option, whereas before.
Exactly.
Yeah. Okay. Anything else that's key we should be looking out for?
No, I think those are the key ones. I mean, in subsidiary rights. So subsidiary rights are in their most valuable expression, translation rights, and if you're a British author, the rights to the income from a sale to an English language publisher outside of the UK, so America most obviously. And similarly, if you're an American author or an Australian or Canadian author, it could be British and Commonwealth rights, for example. So those are subsidiary rights, the most valuable ones. Then you have less valuable subsidiary rights, which might include first and second serialization rights. They might include some merchandising rights, audio rights, book club rights, large print rights, anthology rights, quotation rights, lots of these things. I would offer one general rule, two general rules actually, which is even if whether you have an agent or not, never ever ever part with film and TV or merchandising rights. If you write a novel and you decide you're going to sign an agreement with a publisher and you're not agented, and that novel becomes a monstrous success, then somebody will come knocking at some point and ask you about the film and TV rights. That's the moment when you suck in your pride and appoint an agent to do the deal for you, and they will get a better split for you than your publisher will get for you. Merchandising rights are the rights to make tea towels, mugs, duvet covers, all of that stuff. They will never, ever, 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 ever affect 99% of all books published, 99.99%. But then you come along, you've written a novel about a boy wizard at a boarding school, and all hell breaks loose, and suddenly these things are worth as much as the book rights are globally. And they often get swept up into movie deals because the movie deals can become so valuable that they get swept into that. So you can't really separate the merchandising rights from film and television. If you're going to keep film and TV, you want to keep merchandising to some extent. And there is a 0.0000001% chance that at some point they might become insanely valuable, and you wouldn't mind keeping those, hold. And there are experts in merchandising, right? I mean, we can do them, we know how to do them, but it's quite specialized work, that stuff. I mean, who knows what the royalty rate is on a tea towel? I don't actually, off the top of my head. So they tend to be part of big licensing deals and all that kind of thing. Oh, my telephone's ringing. Somebody's going to get that. So those should be retained. The other thing that authors should be aware of is that publishers, when they are in the preamble about subsidiary rights, they're very good at turning the word gross into the word net. So the value of the deal is transformed from being a gross deal that the author receives a percentage of to the net. Now, what might be deducted to turn gross into net? Well, there are reasonable deductions. Bank charges, they're reasonable. That's a transaction cost. There are these things called withholding taxes, which are too depressing and difficult to go into now, but they're to do with obligations, international treaties to make sure that people are paying their taxes, their income taxes. And sometimes there are these withholding taxes. If you ever get involved in that, take expert advice. And those can be reasonable deductions, but there are also deductions for sub-agents fees. So for example, if you're dealing with a publisher and let's say it's Penguin, for example. Penguin's a very good house. They do good contracts. Their contracts are fair. They have a rights department in-house, and that rights department is very good at selling rights in, say, France or Germany or Spain or wherever. We're very good at selling those rights too. That rights department will probably use in territories where the alphabet is different. Russia, Korea, China, and also in countries that are further away or that are emerging markets. Often they will use sub-agents, which are local agencies in Korea, for example, or in Japan, or in China, who speak the language, who have the network of connections, who are familiar with the publishing deals, because that is really, that's specialist within specialist within specialist. Those agents are entitled to charge for their time. Often those charges can get lopped off the author's share of the deal, and when we use sub-agents, we pay for those people out of our commission. So generally speaking, the author's entitlement should be on the gross amount, not the net amount after sub-agents charges are deducted, because they're never going to be consulted on those things. They have no control over the use of sub-agents. They don't know what the sub-agents' terms of trade are. So it's fair for the publishers to pay for those out of their share of the commission, and for that not to be shared. And it's just worth keeping an eye on that word gross and net. Anywhere that the word net appears in your contract, It's worth just asking questions about. The other thing with publishers is to ask lots of questions about what those clauses mean, and to ask them if they ever vary those clauses in other people's contracts.
Yes, I think this is something like writers get a contract from a publishing house and they assume that that's it, you know, and they don't realize that it's a starting point, and they also don't understand which clauses are actually negotiable and which clauses are kind of set, and they're afraid of appearing naive as well, where, you know, and sort of, yeah, shooting themselves in the foot.
So I've been doing this for 27 years as the CEO of a publishing company, as an agent. I've seen hundreds and hundreds of book publishing contracts. And just the other day, Penguin Random House, which has merged into a giant company, is revising its boilerplates, which I hope doesn't mean bad news for authors. But just, I saw something the other day, and I emailed back and said, I haven't seen this clause before. What is its purpose? What is it intended to achieve? And, you know, nobody begrudges me the answer, and I wasn't embarrassed to ask. So other people shouldn't be either.
That's great. Toby, fantastic. So interesting. So much there, a lot to take in.
Yeah, a lot to take in. Sorry about the detail.
No, the detail is actually the important thing, and it's something that authors don't get to hear a lot about, you know.
Could I just say one more thing?
Yes, please, of course, yes.
So I want to just finish with the point that I made at the beginning. So contracts are about what is possible rather than what is probable. And they're about closing off our areas of ambiguity and that kind of thing. But also, it is possible, if not probable, that every author's book could become the next big thing. And as we know in this business, a big thing can be a very big thing indeed. And you never quite know where it's going to come from. I mean, 50 Shades of Grey started somewhere and the thing sold over 30 million copies worldwide, maybe by some reports even 50 million. So you never know where the next big thing is going to be. And these details, the most important thing is to make sure that one of the most important things is if a book really takes off, becomes a phenomenon, that the author is getting their fair share of the upside. And if a book fails, they're entitled to get their work back, get the rights of their work back in a way that is transparent and clean and clear. But, you know, although authors dream about success, one of the possibilities that a book publishing contract has to acknowledge, because it's about what is possible, not what is probable, is the possibility of very big success. And that's why you have to pay attention to some of these things, because although it might not happen, it probably won't sadly happen this time, it could. It really could.
And can I ask one final question about that? You know, in the situation where something did happen like that and a book exceeded everybody's kind of wildest dreams, can an author go back at that point? You know, is the letter of the contract the letter of the law? Is there any space to say, hey guys, none of us expected this to happen, come on, you know, give us some better terms here?
Okay, I think there are two completely contradictory views on this. I would recommend, as an agent, we take these documents extremely seriously. The publishers do too, and so should anyone who signs one of them. They should think this is a serious document, and it's not a game, this. I should take the letter of this seriously. So that's an extremely important point, and I wouldn't dream of implying otherwise. Within that context, if there is lots of goodwill in the system, if an author's having big success, the publisher probably wants to stay in business with them. If they're having giant success, they're probably going to end up being agented at some point. It is often possible, but you know, you want to keep goodwill in the system. And you know, it's worth remembering that a publisher would like to stay in business with a successful author at the right price. But all of those things should be framed by the clear advice that this is a serious piece of paper. If you're signing it in ink, you should take it seriously.
I think that's a very good place for us to end. Absolutely. Thank you so much for all the fantastic information. I should also say that our book, How Authors Sell Publishing Rights, which I wrote with our legal advisor, Helen Sedgwick, goes into some of what Toby has been talking about here and some other things as well, and looks at various ALLi members who have done various things with rights, be it using, you know, working with one agency, working with a number of different agencies and sub-rights or sub-agents, and selling directly to publishers themselves, all the different ways that an author can kind of go at this and think about it. But I think you'd agree, Toby, that it makes sense now, starting off your writing career, to begin thinking about your book as a bundle of rights, not just publish me please, but what are the various things that are embedded in this document and how can I kind of make the most of it?
Absolutely, I couldn't agree more. There are that pile of papers that you've printed out after all that hard work and working at all those strange times of the day and night, that's sitting in front of you, can be packaged up in innumerable different ways. It can be turned into a number of different products, including a bedspread. It's extraordinary.
Love it. Okay, thank you so much for giving up so much of your time. It's a Friday evening here, so you're very generous, and I know people will have learned lots from Matt, and looking forward to hearing the outcome of your Frankfurt adventures shortly. So yeah, have a good evening. Thank you, and bye for now.
You're very welcome. Thank you.